The sound of charcoal scratching against paper carried through the morning air, so unexpected in this desolate corner of New Mexico territory that Austin O'Brien stopped his horse mid-stride, convinced the isolation had finally driven him to hearing things. He'd ridden out from his ranch before dawn to check the fence lines near the base of the mountains, the same mountains he'd stared at every day for the past 3 years since buying this God-forsaken piece of land outside Aztec. And never once had he heard anything but wind, cattle, and his own thoughts. But there it was again, that distinctive whisper of art being made, accompanied now by the rustle of skirts and a soft feminine sigh of concentration. Austin guided his mare around a cluster of juniper trees and felt his breath catch in his chest. A woman sat on a flat boulder about 50 yards up the rocky incline, her back straight as a lodgepole pine, one hand moving rapidly across a large sketch pad propped on her knees. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to dance in the breeze. She wore a simple traveling dress the color of moss, and beside her on the rock sat a worn leather satchel overflowing with art supplies. She hadn't noticed him yet, too absorbed in whatever she was creating, and Austin found himself frozen in place, afraid that any movement might shatter this impossible vision like morning frost under the sun. In the 3 years since he'd settled here after the war ended in 1865, now in this year of 1868, he'd seen exactly 4 women pass through his property. One had been the wife of a traveling preacher, 2 had been soiled doves heading to the mining camps up north, and the last had been old Mrs. Henderson bringing him a sympathy casserole after his ranch hand died of fever. None of them had been young, beautiful, or sketching his mountains as if they were the most fascinating things in all creation. His horse nickered softly, and the woman's head snapped up. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the distance, her eyes wide with surprise that he could see even from here, probably blue or green given her coloring, though he couldn't be certain. Then she smiled, not the nervous twitter he might have expected, but a genuine expression of pleasure at seeing another human being in this isolated place. "Good morning," she called out, her voice carrying clear and melodic on the dry air. "I hope you don't mind. I'm not trespassing, am I?" The man at the general store in Aztec said this land was open range. Austin found his voice, though it came out rougher than he'd intended after hours of silence. "That man doesn't know what he's talking about. This is my land, has been for 3 years now." He urged his horse forward, picking his way carefully across the rocky ground until he was close enough to see her properly. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably 22 or 23 at most, with a heart-shaped face dusted with freckles and eyes that were indeed blue, the color of summer sky just after dawn. Her expression shifted from friendly to apologetic in an instant. "Oh, I'm so terribly sorry. I'll pack up immediately. I didn't mean to intrude on private property." She started gathering her supplies with quick, efficient movements, though he noticed she kept her sketch carefully turned away from his view. "Wait." The word came out sharper than he intended, and she froze, looking up at him with those remarkable eyes. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how he must look after a week without proper grooming, his dark hair too long, his jaw covered in stubble, his clothes dusty from the trail. "I didn't say you had to leave. I just said it was my land. There's a difference." She studied him for a long moment, and Austin had the unsettling feeling she was cataloging every detail of his appearance the way an artist might, filing it away for future reference. He was 30 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work, with hazel eyes that his mother had once said changed color with his moods. Right now, they were probably more green than brown, the way they always got when he was feeling something he couldn't quite name. "Are you certain?" "I wouldn't want to impose." Her fingers had stilled on her satchel, waiting for his answer. "What are you drawing?" He swung down from his horse, ground tying her with the ease of long practice. The woman relaxed slightly as he approached, though he was careful to keep a respectful distance. "The mountains," she said simply, then turned her sketchpad around to show him. Austin had spent countless hours staring at those mountains, memorizing every ridge and shadow, but he'd never seen them like this. Her drawing captured something he'd felt, but never been able to articulate. A sense of ancient majesty and quiet endurance, of beauty that existed whether anyone was there to witness it or not. She'd rendered the peaks in careful detail, but it was the play of light and shadow across the slopes that truly brought the image to life. "That's remarkable," he said quietly, meaning it. "I've never seen them look quite like that, even though I look at them every single day." Her face lit up with pleasure at the compliment. "Thank you. They're extraordinary, aren't they? I've been traveling through New Mexico territory for the past month, sketching the landscape, and these are some of the most beautiful formations I've encountered." She looked back at her drawing with a critical eye. "Though I'm not sure I'm doing them justice." "You're doing better than justice. You're showing the truth of them." Austin realized he was staring and forced himself to look away, back at the mountains themselves. "I'm Austin O'Brien. I own the ranch that spreads out from here for about 3,000 acres. "Julia Morrison," she replied, extending her hand in a gesture that was both formal and surprisingly modern. Her grip was firm when he took it, her fingers stained with charcoal and what looked like ink. "I'm from Philadelphia originally, but I've been traveling throughout the West for the past year, documenting the landscapes for a series of illustrated articles." "Articles?" He released her hand reluctantly, noting the calluses on her fingertips that spoke of years of dedication to her craft. "Yes, I write as well as draw. Several Eastern magazines have expressed interest in publishing accounts of life and scenery in the territories. It's still quite exotic to people back east, you understand. They want to know what it's really like out here, beyond the sensationalized dime novels and tall tales." She settled back onto her rock, apparently deciding he wasn't a threat. "Though I'm afraid my accounts might disappoint them. I haven't encountered any dramatic shootouts or Indian raids. Mostly just beautiful, empty land and genuinely kind people." Austin found himself smiling for the first time in recent memory. "Empty is right. I sometimes go weeks without seeing another soul besides my ranch hands, and they're not much for conversation. Is it lonely?" The question was direct, almost uncomfortably so, but her eyes held genuine curiosity rather than pity. "Yes," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Something about this woman, this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere to sketch his mountains, made him want to tell the truth. "Very lonely, but it's better than the alternative." She tilted her head, studying him again with that artist's gaze. "What's the alternative?" "Being around people who remind me of things I'd rather forget." He hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to reveal anything personal, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. Julia nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "The war, among other things." He changed the subject before she could probe deeper into wounds that were still too raw to examine. "How long are you planning to stay in the area?" "I'm not sure. I have a room at the boarding house in Aztec for the week, but I might extend if there's more to sketch. This landscape is quite different from anything else I've seen in the territory. Less desert, more mountains and high grassland." She glanced at her half-finished drawing, then back at him, a spark of something playful entering her expression. "Though I must admit, I've been focusing entirely on landscapes. I haven't attempted any figure studies since leaving Philadelphia. Figure studies. He wasn't familiar with the term. Drawings of people, she clarified. It's an essential skill for any serious artist, but I haven't had many willing subjects during my travels. Most people are either too busy or too suspicious of a woman with a sketchpad. She paused, and he could see her gathering her courage for something. Would you consider sitting for me? Just for a quick sketch. Nothing too formal. It would be interesting to capture a real rancher against this landscape. Much more authentic than anything I could stage back east. Austin felt heat creep up his neck, a flush he hadn't experienced since he was a boy. I'm not much to look at, especially not after a week on the range. I disagree, Julia said simply, already reaching for a fresh piece of paper. You look exactly like what you are, which is what good art should capture, not some idealized version but the truth. She gestured to a spot near her rock. Would you mind standing just there? The light is perfect at this angle. He should have said no. He had fence lines to check, cattle to count, 100 tasks that needed attention. But something about the hopefulness in her expression, the way she'd already positioned her charcoal as if his agreement was a foregone conclusion, made refusal impossible. All right, he said, moving to where she'd indicated. But just one quick sketch. I have work to do. Of course, just one. She was already drawing, her hand moving with confident strokes across the paper. Try to stand naturally. Don't pose or anything formal, just be yourself. Being himself was harder than it sounded when he was acutely aware of her gaze moving over him, studying the line of his shoulders, the way his hat shadowed his face, the stance he'd adopted without thinking, weight on one leg, thumbs hooked through his belt. He tried to focus on the mountains instead, on the familiar peaks that had become his only real companions over these isolated years. You can talk if you want, Julia said after a few minutes of silence. In fact, I prefer it. Conversation helps people relax, and relaxed subjects always produce better drawings. I'm not much for talking either, he admitted. 3 years alone will do that to a man. 3 years. You've been here that long without regular company. She sounded genuinely shocked. I have 2 ranch hands who help during calving and roundup, but they live in town. The rest of the time, it's just me and the cattle. He shifted slightly, and she made a small gesture indicating he should return to his original position. It suits me fine. I had enough of crowds and noise during the war. Which side? The question was asked carefully, without judgment. Union. I was at Gettysburg, among other places. The memories tried to surface, but he pushed them down. When it was over, I just wanted to get as far from civilization as possible. New Mexico territory seemed about right. Julia worked in silence for a moment, the only sound the whisper of charcoal on paper and the wind moving through the juniper. I lost my brother at Antietam, she said quietly. He was 19, barely old enough to shave. Sometimes I think about all the art he might have created, all the life he might have lived, and I feel angry at the waste of it all. I'm sorry for your loss. The words were inadequate, as they always were, but he meant them. Thank you. It's why I started traveling, actually. After he died, Philadelphia felt suffocating. All those narrow streets and dark buildings, everyone in mourning for someone, the whole city weighted down with grief. I needed open spaces, needed to see beauty again. She glanced up from her sketch, meeting his eyes. Is that why you came here? To find beauty again. I came here to forget, Austin said honestly. The beauty was just an unexpected bonus. And has it worked? The forgetting? He considered the question, really thought about it for the first time. No, but the remembering is quieter here, if that makes sense. Like the memories can't shout as loud when they're competing with all this space and silence. That makes perfect sense, Julia said softly. She made a few more marks on her paper, then sat back with a satisfied expression. There, that's what I was looking for. Austin moved closer to see what she'd created and felt something shift in his chest. She'd drawn him as part of the landscape, not separate from it, his form echoing the vertical lines of the distant pines, his stillness matching the ancient patience of the mountains behind him. He looked both solitary and somehow complete, a man who belonged exactly where he was, even in his loneliness. "Is that really how you see me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. "It's how you are," she replied, studying the sketch with a critical eye. "Whether you see it or not, you've grown roots here, deep ones. This place is part of you now, and you're part of it." They stood there in the morning light, two people who'd been strangers an hour ago, connected now by charcoal and paper and truths neither had expected to share. Austin knew he should leave, should get back to his work, but he found himself reluctant to break this unexpected spell. "Will you come back tomorrow?" The words were out before he could reconsider them. "To draw the mountains, I mean. The light changes throughout the day. Afternoon might give you a completely different perspective." Julia's smile was like sunrise, slow and warming everything it touched. "I'd like that very much. And perhaps you could show me some of your ranch. I'd love to sketch the cattle, the corrals, the everyday details of ranch life. My readers would find that fascinating, I think." "Tomorrow, then," he agreed, his heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar in his chest. "I'll meet you here at dawn if that's not too early. Dawn is perfect. That's when the light is most interesting anyway." She was already packing up her supplies, moving with practiced efficiency. "I should head back to town. I promised Mrs. Chen at the boarding house I'd be back for lunch, and I still need to organize my notes from this morning." Austin helped her gather her things, then walked her back down the rocky slope to where he'd left his horse. At the base of the incline, he spotted her own transportation, a sturdy paint mare tied to a scrub oak, with saddlebags that looked well worn from travel. "You ride out here alone?" he asked, concerned despite himself. "I've been riding alone for months now," Julia said matter-of-factly. "Though I appreciate the concern, I'm quite capable with both a horse and a pistol should the need arise." She patted one of her saddlebags, where he could just make out the outline of a small revolver. "The West has been far safer than people warned me it would be. Mostly, I encounter genuine kindness. Still, this country can be unpredictable. If you're planning to come back tomorrow, I could meet you at the edge of my property near the main road. Escort you in properly." "That's very gentlemanly of you, Mr. O'Brien." There was amusement in her voice, but also something warmer. "But I think I can find my way. I have an excellent sense of direction, and I marked the trail carefully this morning." "Austin," he said, "if you're going to be drawing on my land, you should call me Austin. Austin, then, and you should call me Julia." She swung up into her saddle with easy grace, arranging her skirts and securing her satchel. "I'll see you tomorrow at dawn, and Austin, thank you for not chasing me off your land, and for letting me draw you. It meant more than you might think." "The pleasure was mine," he said, and realized he meant it completely. "Ride safe, Julia." He watched her navigate down the trail toward the main road, her figure growing smaller against the vast landscape until she disappeared around a bend. Only then did he remount his own horse and turn back toward his fence lines, though his mind was no longer on work. Instead, he kept seeing those blue eyes studying him with such focus, kept feeling the strange vulnerability of being truly seen for the first time in years. The rest of the day passed in a blur of familiar tasks made unfamiliar by his distraction. He checked fences without really seeing them, counted cattle without keeping proper track, and nearly rode past the section where 3 posts needed replacing because his thoughts were elsewhere. By the time he returned to his small ranch house as the sun was setting, he was no closer to understanding what had happened to him that morning. Why a chance encounter with a traveling artist had knocked his carefully ordered world so thoroughly off its axis. His house was simple, just 4 rooms built from rough-hewn logs and local stone. A main room that served as kitchen and living space, a bedroom barely large enough for his bed and a chest of drawers, a small room he'd meant to use as an office but had never bothered to furnish, and a washroom with a pump that drew water from a well he'd dug his second month on the property. It was functional, nothing more, and he'd never minded its austerity until now. Now, seeing it through what he imagined might be Julia's eyes, he noticed how bare the walls were, how sparse the furnishings, how the whole place had the feeling of temporary quarters rather than a real home. He lit a lamp against the gathering darkness and made himself a simple dinner of beans, bacon, and coffee, the same meal he ate most nights. As he ate, he found himself thinking about what Julia had said, about traveling to see beauty again after her brother's death. He wondered what Philadelphia had been like for her, wondered about the life she'd left behind to wander through territories that most Eastern women would consider terrifying. There was courage in what she was doing, a kind of bravery he recognized from his own desperate flight westward after the war. Sleep came hard that night, his mind too full of blue eyes and charcoal sketches, and the sound of a woman's voice discussing art and truth in the shadow of his mountains. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of lines on paper that turned into living things, of landscapes that breathed and moved, of a presence beside him that made the silence feel like companionship rather than isolation. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, but instead of his usual routine of coffee and chores, he found himself heating water for a proper wash. He shaved carefully, something he usually only bothered with once a week, and changed into his newest shirt, a dark blue cotton that his mother had sent him 2 Christmases ago, and that he'd barely worn because there'd been no occasion special enough to merit it. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that Julia was just a visitor passing through, that she'd be gone within a week, and he'd return to his solitary existence as if she'd never appeared. But he polished his boots anyway, and made sure his hat wasn't too battered and checked his reflection in the small mirror above his wash basin more times than he cared to admit. The ride out to where he'd met Julia yesterday took 20 minutes at an easy pace, and he arrived just as the sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of gold and rose. He'd half convinced himself during the ride that she wouldn't show up, that perhaps the whole encounter had been some loneliness-induced hallucination. But as he rounded the familiar cluster of junipers, he saw her already there, setting up her supplies on the same flat boulder, her paint mare contentedly grazing nearby. She looked up at his approach and waved, her smile bright even in the early morning dimness. She wore a different dress today, a practical divided riding skirt in brown corduroy and a white blouse with the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, ready for work. Her hair was in a thick braid down her back, and she'd tied a bandana around her forehead to keep stray wisps out of her face. "Good morning," she called out. "I hope you don't mind, but I got here early." The dawn light on these mountains is absolutely spectacular, and I wanted to capture it before it changed. Austin dismounted and walked up the slope to join her, leading his mare. "I don't mind at all. I'm glad you came back. Did you think I wouldn't?" She was already sketching, her hand moving rapidly across the page as she tried to catch the fleeting colors of sunrise on the peaks. "I thought maybe you'd reconsider. Realize you had better ways to spend your time than sitting on rocks in the middle of nowhere." He settled onto a nearby boulder, content to watch her work. This is exactly how I want to spend my time, Julia said firmly. This is the whole reason I came west. These moments, this light, this feeling of being present at the beginning of the world, it's what I've been searching for. She glanced at him, her expression serious. Besides, I enjoyed our conversation yesterday. It's been a long time since I talked to someone who understood about needing space and silence. They fell into a comfortable quiet, broken only by the scratch of her charcoal and the morning sounds of the land waking up around them. Austin watched the sun climb higher, watched the way Julia's face reflected her concentration, the slight furrow between her brows when something wasn't quite right, the satisfied curve of her mouth when she captured exactly what she wanted. He'd never thought of art as physical work before, but seeing her completely absorbed in the act of creation, he understood that it was every bit as demanding as rounding up cattle or mending fences. "Tell me about your ranch," Julia said after perhaps half an hour of focused sketching. "You said it's 3,000 acres. About that. I run mostly cattle, some horses. It's not a big operation, not compared to some of the spreads up north, but it's enough for one man." He picked up a stick and started drawing idle patterns in the dirt at his feet. "I bought the land with my mustering out pay and what I'd saved during the war. Seemed like a good investment at the time, though I didn't really know what I was doing. And now, do you know what you're doing?" Her tone was gently teasing, mostly. "I've made plenty of mistakes, lost cattle to winter storms and predators, nearly went broke the first year when prices dropped. But I'm still here, still making a living." He tossed the stick aside. "It's honest work at least, and the land doesn't judge you for what you've done or haven't done." Julia set down her charcoal and gave him her full attention. "You've mentioned the war twice now, and both times you've spoken about wanting to forget or escape. May I ask what happened? You don't have to tell me if it's too painful." Austin was quiet for a long moment, surprised to find that he actually wanted to tell her, wanted to share the burden he'd been carrying alone for 3 years. "I was a sharpshooter," he said finally. "I was good at it, too good. They'd put me in position and tell me which officers to target, and I'd do it. Clean shots from hundreds of yards away. I told myself I was helping end the war faster, that every enemy officer I killed meant fewer enlisted men would die following bad orders. But at the end of the day, I was just a killer with a good excuse." "You were a soldier following orders during a war," Julia said quietly. "That's different from being a killer." "Is it? I still see their faces sometimes in dreams. Men I never met, never spoke to, just looked at through a rifle sight and then ended." He was staring at the mountains now, unable to meet her eyes. "After Appomattox, I couldn't stomach the idea of going back to normal life." "How do you go back to Sunday dinners and social calls when you've got blood on your hands? So I came here, where there's nobody to pretend for." Julia moved from her rock to sit beside him on his, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "My brother was a sharpshooter too," she said softly. "He wrote me letters about it, about how it felt to be good at something so terrible. He said it was like being split in two, the part of him that was just doing his duty and the part that knew he'd carry those deaths forever." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish he'd survived to come find his own mountain like you did. I think he might have found peace here too." Without thinking, Austin reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently. She squeezed back and they sat like that for a while, two people carrying war-shaped holes in their hearts, finding unexpected comfort in shared understanding. "Thank you for telling me," Julia said eventually, "and for trusting me with it." "I've never told anyone before," Austin admitted. "Not the ranch hands, not the few people I've met in town. I didn't think anyone would understand." "I understand," she said simply, and he knew she meant it. The moment stretched between them, heavy with significance, until Julia gave his hand one final squeeze and released it, returning to her sketching with renewed focus. Austin sat and watched her work, feeling something inside him that had been frozen for years beginning to thaw. It was uncomfortable, this thawing, like feeling returning to frostbitten fingers, painful but necessary. As the sun climbed higher, Julia finished her dawn sketch and started another, this one focusing on the play of light across the grasslands that stretched away from the mountains. Austin found himself describing the land to her, pointing out where his property lines ran, where the best water sources were, where he'd found Indian pottery shards that suggested this had been important land long before white settlers arrived. "You ever see them? The Indians?" Julia asked, adding careful details to her drawing. "Sometimes. There's a small band of Utes that passes through a few times a year following the seasons. We've reached an understanding. I let them take a steer or two and they leave the rest of my cattle alone. Seems fair, since this was their land long before it was mine." He stretched his long legs out in front of him. "Their leader, man named Walking Bear, stopped by last fall and shared coffee with me. We couldn't speak much, just a few words of Spanish between us, but we sat on my porch for an hour and watched the sunset together. It was one of the more pleasant evenings I've had." Julia looked up from her sketch with interest. "Would you introduce me if they come through again?" "I'd love to sketch them if they'd permit it, though I know some tribes consider it bad luck or invasive. If they come through and you're still here, I'll ask." Walking Bear seemed like a reasonable man. The words "if you're still here" hung between them, a reminder that Julia's presence was temporary, that she'd move on soon to sketch other landscapes, write other articles, while he remained here with his cattle and his mountains and his solitude. "I might be here longer than I initially planned," Julia said, as if reading his thoughts. "There's something about this place that feels significant, like there are stories here that need to be told." She met his eyes, and not just stories about landscapes. "What other kind of stories?" Austin asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "Human stories. Stories about people who came west looking for something, whether they found it or not, whether they even knew what they were looking for." She gestured at him with her charcoal. "Your story, for instance." A Union sharpshooter who became a rancher in the New Mexico territory, finding peace in isolation. That's the kind of account my readers would find genuinely interesting, much more than another description of mountains and sky. Austin felt his chest tighten with instinctive resistance. "I'm not sure I want my story told to Eastern magazine readers." "Then I won't tell it, not if you're uncomfortable with it. I'll stick to landscapes and leave the human element out entirely." She said it easily, without pressure, and he believed her. "But I hope you'll think about it. Your story deserves to be told, even if you don't think so." They spent the rest of the morning together, Julia sketching various views while Austin alternated between watching her work and attending to small tasks he'd been putting off, tightening a cinch on his saddle, checking his mare's hooves for stones, oiling his rifle. It felt companionable, this parallel work, each of them focused but aware of the other's presence, comfortable in a way that surprised him. Around midday, Austin unpacked the lunch he'd brought, dried beef and hard biscuits and apples from a tree near his house, along with a canteen of cool water. Julia produced her own supplies, cheese and bread and dried apricots, and they shared a makeshift meal on the flat boulder that had become their meeting place. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Austin said between bites. "What was your life like before you started traveling?" Julia considered the question, her expression turning thoughtful. "Comfortable, I suppose. My father is a lawyer, quite successful, and we lived in a nice house in a respectable neighborhood. I had art tutors, attended the right parties, was expected to marry appropriately and settle into the life my parents had planned for me. She bit into an apricot, chewing slowly. My brother was the only one who understood that I wanted something different. He encouraged my art, told me I should pursue it seriously rather than treat it as just an accomplishment for attracting a husband. And after he died, everything changed. My parents wanted me to marry quickly, said it would help me heal, but I couldn't bear the thought of being locked into that conventional life when Marcus had lost any chance at life at all. So I used my inheritance from my grandmother to fund this traveling project, told my parents I needed time to grieve, and left. She looked out at the vast landscape surrounding them. They think I'm staying with a widowed aunt in Santa Fe, being safely supervised. They don't know I've been traveling alone. Won't they worry when they find out the truth? Austin asked. Probably, but I'll deal with that when I return, if I return. She said it lightly, but he heard the serious undertone. I'm not sure I can go back to that life, Austin. Now that I've had a taste of freedom, of actually doing something meaningful with my art, the thought of returning to endless tea parties and embroidery circles makes me feel like I'm suffocating. You don't have to go back, he heard himself say. There's nothing stopping you from making a life out here if that's what you want. Julia smiled at him, and it was the saddest smile he'd ever seen. It's not that simple for women. I have enough money to travel for maybe another 6 months, a year if I'm careful. But eventually, I'll need to return to some kind of conventional life unless I want to end up destitute. The magazines pay me for my articles and drawings, but not enough to truly support myself indefinitely. And respectable jobs for women are scarce, especially out here. The unfairness of it struck Austin hard. The way Julia's talent and courage and determination were still bound by society's restrictions in ways his had never been. He'd been free to walk away from his old life, to start over completely, while she could only steal temporary freedom before circumstances forced her back into the cage. That's not right, he said fiercely. You're more capable than half the men I've met out here. You should be able to make your own choices. Thank you for saying that, but should and is are two very different things. She gathered up the remnants of their lunch, repacking her supplies with careful movements. I'm trying to make the most of the time I have. That's all any of us can do, really. They fell silent after that, both lost in their own thoughts, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Austin found himself thinking about possibilities, about what it might mean if Julia stayed longer than a week, stayed long enough for this tenuous connection between them to grow into something more substantial. It was a dangerous line of thinking, he knew, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. The afternoon wore on, the light changing as the sun tracked across the sky. Julia captured it all, filling page after page with sketches, occasionally showing him her work and explaining what she was trying to achieve with different techniques. Austin absorbed it all, fascinated by the way her mind worked, the way she saw patterns and compositions in landscapes he'd been looking at for years without truly seeing. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Julia finally set down her charcoal and stretched her arms above her head, working out the stiffness from hours of focused work. I should head back to town soon. Mrs. Chen will start to worry if I'm out too late. I'll ride with you, Austin said, standing and offering her a hand up. Make sure you get to the main road safely at least. That's not necessary, Julia protested, though she took his hand and let him help her up. I'm perfectly capable of finding my way. I know you are. But it would make me feel better knowing you got back safe. He held her gaze, and she must have seen something there that convinced her, because she nodded. All right. Thank you, Austin, that's kind of you. They packed up her supplies and secured everything to her saddle. working together with an ease that suggested they'd been doing this for years rather than days. As they rode down from the mountains together, their horses walking side by side along the trail, Austin realized he didn't want this day to end. More than that, he didn't want any of his days to go back to the way they'd been before Julia appeared in his life, silent and solitary, and marked only by the passage of seasons. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked as they reached the boundary of his property where it met the main road to Aztec. Julia looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw his own reluctance to part reflected in her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "If you'd like me to, I would. Very much." The admission felt dangerous, like revealing too much too soon, but he couldn't take it back, didn't want to take it back. "Then I'll be here at dawn again." She started to turn her horse toward town, then paused. "Austin, I'm glad I trespassed on your land. I'm glad you didn't chase me off." "So am I," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So am I, Julia." He watched her ride away until she was out of sight, then turned his own horse back toward his ranch, toward the evening chores that waited, toward the lonely house that had stopped feeling like enough the moment a woman with charcoal-stained fingers started sketching his mountains. That night, lying in bed with moonlight streaming through his window, Austin let himself imagine a future that involved more than just survival and solitude. He imagined Julia at his breakfast table, imagined her setting up an easel in his empty office, imagined her laugh echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. He imagined, and for the first time in 3 years, he let himself want something more than just forgetting. The next 3 days fell into a pattern that felt both natural and extraordinary. Julia would arrive at dawn, and Austin would already be there waiting, and they'd spend the morning hours together while she sketched, and he worked on various tasks he could do in her vicinity. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts, discussing art and ranching and philosophy and dreams, building between them a foundation of understanding and genuine friendship that felt more intimate than anything Austin had experienced before. Julia sketched the mountains in morning light and afternoon shadows. She drew Austin's small ranch house from various angles, capturing the way it sat humble and sturdy against the vast landscape. She spent an entire morning at his corrals, sketching his cattle and horses with quick, sure strokes that caught their essential nature. And she drew Austin himself several more times, always when he was absorbed in work and not posing, catching him in moments of unguarded authenticity. For his part, Austin found himself opening up in ways he'd thought impossible. He told her about growing up in Ohio, about his parents who died within months of each other right before the war started, about the sweetheart he'd left behind when he enlisted and who'd married someone else before he returned. He told her about the Battle of Gettysburg, about the things he'd seen and done, about the nightmares that still woke him some nights even 3 years later. And in return, Julia told him about her brother Marcus, about the guilt she carried for being alive when he wasn't, about her complicated relationship with parents who loved her, but couldn't understand her need for something beyond their conventional expectations. They were sitting by a small creek on the 4th day, Julia sketching the way water moved over rocks while Austin lay on the grass nearby, his hat over his face to shade against the midday sun, when she said something that changed everything. "I extended my stay at the boarding house," she said casually, too casually, "for another 2 weeks. Austin sat up so quickly his hat tumbled into the grass. 2 weeks. If that's all right with you, I told Mrs. Chen I'd found excellent subjects for my articles and needed more time to do them justice." Julia kept her eyes on her sketch pad, but he could see a faint flush coloring her cheeks. "I can sketch elsewhere if you're tired of me trespassing on your property." I'm not tired of it, Austin said quickly. Not even close to tired of it. I'm just surprised. Pleased, but surprised. I'm pleased too, Julia admitted, finally looking up at him with those remarkable blue eyes. I was worried you might think I was imposing, overstaying my welcome. Julia, you could stay the whole summer and it wouldn't be too long. The words came out before he could think better of them, raw and honest and revealing far more than he'd intended. The air between them seemed to shift then, to take on weight and significance. Julia set down her sketchpad carefully, deliberately, and turned to face him fully. Austin, I need to tell you something. His heart started beating faster. What is it? I didn't extend my stay just for the sketching. I mean, yes, this landscape is beautiful and perfect for my articles, but that's not the real reason. She took a deep breath, gathering courage. The real reason is you. I've been thinking about you constantly, looking forward to our mornings together more than I should, feeling disappointed when we have to part at the end of the day. And I know it's impractical and probably foolish, but I needed to be honest about it. Austin felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. You're thinking about me, constantly, Julia repeated, a slight smile playing at her lips. I tried to convince myself it was just because you're an interesting subject for my work that I was being professional, but that's not true. The truth is I find you fascinating and kind and unexpectedly funny when you relax enough to show it. The truth is I haven't felt this comfortable with anyone since my brother died. The truth is when I'm with you, I don't feel like I'm performing or playing a role. I just feel like myself, and that's remarkably rare for me. Austin moved closer to her, close enough to see the individual freckles scattered across her nose, close enough to see the hope and fear warring in her expression. I've been thinking about you too, he said quietly. From that first morning, when I heard you sketching and thought I'd finally lost my mind. I've been alone so long, Julia, and I thought I preferred it that way. But these past few days with you, I've remembered what it feels like to want to share things with someone, to look forward to tomorrow because it means seeing you again. What do we do about it? Julia whispered. I don't know, Austin admitted. I'm not good at this, at feelings and courtship and all the things I'm supposed to do. But I know I don't want to waste the next 2 weeks pretending this is just professional interest or casual friendship. Julia reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his in a gesture that felt both daring and absolutely right. Neither do I. So let's not pretend. Let's just see where this goes, honestly and openly. Austin looked down at their joined hands, at the way her small fingers fit perfectly between his larger ones, and felt something settle in his chest, something that had been restless and searching for years finally coming to rest. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that very much. They sat there by the creek for a long time, holding hands and talking about possibilities, about what it might mean if this connection between them continued to grow, about the practical realities they'd have to face. Julia would eventually run out of money and have to make decisions about her future. Austin had a ranch to run and couldn't just abandon it. The society they lived in had expectations about courtship and marriage that couldn't be ignored entirely, no matter how much both of them might want to. But in that moment, none of the complications seemed insurmountable. In that moment, with the sun warm on their faces and the sound of water over rocks providing a gentle soundtrack, anything felt possible. That night, Austin invited Julia to have dinner at his ranch house, the first time anyone besides himself had entered those 4 rooms since he'd built them 3 years ago. She accepted, and he spent the afternoon in a frenzy of cleaning and preparation, suddenly seeing all the flaws and bare spaces he'd ignored for so long. He swept and scrubbed, hung a blanket over the worst crack in the wall, picked wildflowers and put them in a jar on his table because he'd once heard women liked such things. Julia arrived just before sunset, riding up to his house with her saddlebags full of supplies. She'd brought a pie from the bakery in town, fresh bread, and butter that was still cool from Mrs. Chen's spring house. Austin had managed a decent stew using the vegetables from his small garden plot and some beef from a steer he'd slaughtered last month. And together, they set the table like this was the most normal thing in the world, like they'd been sharing meals for years. "Your home is lovely," Julia said, looking around the main room with genuine interest. "Sparse but lovely. It has good bones." "It's pretty empty," Austin admitted. "I've never been much for decorating. It's honest like you, nothing unnecessary, but everything that's here serves a purpose." She touched the mantel above his fireplace, running her fingers over the rough wood. "Though I think it could use some art on the walls. All this empty space is practically begging for sketches or paintings." "I don't have any art to hang," Austin said, ladling stew into bowls. Julia smiled at him over her shoulder. "You do now. I was planning to give you some of the sketches I've done of your ranch. They should hang here where they belong." The thought of Julia's art on his walls, of being able to see her vision of his land every day even when she wasn't physically present, made his chest tight with emotion. "I'd be honored," he managed. They ate slowly, savoring both the food and the conversation, neither wanting the evening to end. Julia told him more about Philadelphia, about the art galleries she used to visit, about her dreams of maybe having her own show someday featuring her Western landscapes. Austin talked about his hopes for expanding his ranch, maybe adding more horses to his breeding program, maybe even hiring more permanent help so the work wasn't quite so consuming. "You ever think about having a family?" Julia asked, then immediately flushed. "I'm sorry, that's too forward." "You don't have to answer." "No, it's all right." Austin poured them both more coffee, considering his response. "I used to think about it before the war. I was engaged briefly and we talked about having children, building a life together. But after she married someone else and I came out here, I put those thoughts away. Didn't seem like something possible for me anymore." He met Julia's eyes across the table. "Until recently, maybe." The weight of implication hung between them, heavy with potential futures neither quite dared to speak aloud yet. Instead, Julia reached across the table and took his hand again, that gesture that was becoming familiar, that said more than words could. After dinner, they moved outside to Austin's small porch, sitting on the wooden steps and watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The night was cool but comfortable, with none of the harsh cold that would come with winter. In the distance, cattle lowed softly, settling for the night, and somewhere a coyote called, lonely and wild. "I never see stars like this in Philadelphia," Julia said softly, her head tilted back to take in the vast display above them. "There's too much smoke and light. But out here, it's like you can see forever." "It was one of the first things I loved about this place," Austin said. "That sense of infinite space, like the sky goes on and all your problems are too small to matter against something so vast." Julia leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder in a gesture of trust that made his heart stutter. Without thinking, he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer. They fit together perfectly, her smaller frame tucked against his side like that's where she was always meant to be. "Austin," her voice was quiet, almost tentative. "Yes. What happens at the end of my 2 weeks?" The question he'd been avoiding thinking about, the complication he knew was coming but had been pushing away. "I don't know," he admitted. "What do you want to happen?" "I want to stay longer. I want to keep learning about you, about this place, about this feeling I get when we're together." She shifted to look up at him, her face pale in the starlight. "But I also have responsibilities back east, family obligations I can't ignore forever. And we've only known each other less than a week, Austin. It seems reckless to make big decisions based on something so new." "Sometimes the best things are reckless," he said quietly. "I bought this ranch after knowing nothing about ranching, moved to a territory I'd never seen before, started completely over with no guarantee it would work. That was reckless too, but it was the right choice." "You think this is the right choice? Us?" There was vulnerability in her question, a hope she was trying to protect by not assuming too much. Austin took a breath, then decided to risk everything by telling the complete truth. "Julia, I've been half alive for 3 years, just going through the motions, telling myself isolation was what I needed. Then you showed up sketching my mountains, and something woke up in me that I thought had died in the war. I don't know if that's love or just desperation for human connection, but I know I want to find out. I know I want more time with you, as much time as you're willing to give me." Julia turned fully in his arms, bringing her hands up to frame his face, her palms cool against his cheeks. "I want that too," she said. "More time, more of you, more of this. I'll stay the 2 weeks and then we'll figure out the next step. Together." "Together," Austin echoed, and then, because it felt like the only possible next move, he leaned down and kissed her. It was tentative at first, both of them uncertain, out of practice or maybe never properly practiced to begin with. But then Julia made a small sound of pleasure and leaned into him, and the kiss deepened, became more confident. She tasted like coffee and pie and something indefinably sweet, and kissing her felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding something precious he hadn't known he'd lost. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Julia laughed softly. "I've been wanting you to do that for 2 days now." "Why didn't you say something?" Austin asked, unable to keep from smiling. "Because I'm supposed to be a respectable lady, and respectable ladies don't ask men to kiss them." She was grinning now too. "Though I'm learning that I'm not very good at being respectable." "Thank God for that," Austin said, and kissed her again. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of joy and discovery that Austin knew he'd remember for the rest of his life. He and Julia fell into a routine that felt both natural and extraordinary. She'd arrive at his ranch each morning, sometimes before dawn to catch the early light, and they'd spend the day together, working side by side, her sketching while he attended to his endless list of tasks. But now there was an added dimension to their time together, a physical affection that expressed itself in casual touches, stolen kisses, hands held as they walked through his property. Julia sketched everything, filling pad after pad with drawings. She captured the mountains in every mood and light, the ranch buildings from every angle, the cattle and horses in motion and at rest. But she also drew Austin, constantly, catching him in moments of work and rest, building a visual record of their time together that felt both artistic and deeply personal. Austin, for his part, found himself seeing his ranch through new eyes. Julia's enthusiasm for details he'd stopped noticing made him appreciate what he'd built here. The clean lines of his corrals, the careful placement of his house to catch the morning sun, the way the grasslands stretched toward the mountains in an endless roll of gold and green. She made him proud of what he'd accomplished, of the life he'd carved out of this wild land. They talked endlessly, sharing thoughts and dreams and fears with an honesty that felt reckless and necessary. Julia told him about her frustration with the limitations placed on women, her anger at a society that treated her art as a hobby rather than a serious profession. Austin talked about his struggle with faith after the war, how he'd stopped believing in a benevolent God when he'd seen what men could do to each other. They disagreed sometimes, their discussions becoming heated debates, but that only made their connection feel more real, more solid. On the 8th day of Julia's extended stay, Walking Bear and his small band of Utes passed through Austin's land on their seasonal migration. Austin kept his promise and introduced Julia, asking in his limited Spanish if they'd be willing to let her sketch them. Walking Bear considered for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Julia with an intensity that might have been unnerving if not for the wisdom and humor she could see there. Finally, he nodded and agreed, on the condition that Austin translate her questions and his answers accurately. Julia spent the entire afternoon sketching Walking Bear and his people, capturing not just their appearance but something of their dignity and resilience. She drew Walking Bear's weathered face with careful respect, showing the lines etched by years of sun and wind and hard living. She sketched the women working to set up camp, the children playing with a makeshift ball, the men tending to horses and equipment. And through it all, Austin translated, facilitating a conversation between Julia and Walking Bear about land and loss and the strange inevitability of change. "He says you see clearly," Austin told Julia as the sun began to set and Walking Bear prepared to end the session. "He says your drawings show the truth of people, not just their surfaces. He says that's a rare gift and you should honor it." Julia thanked Walking Bear in Spanish, one of the few phrases she'd learned, and presented him with one of her sketches as a gift. The old leader studied it for a long moment, then nodded approvingly and said something else in his language that Austin didn't fully understand, but that sounded like a blessing. That night, as they sat together on Austin's porch reviewing Julia's sketches from the day, she was quieter than usual, thoughtful in a way that seemed to signal something significant turning over in her mind. "What are you thinking about?" Austin asked, his arm around her shoulders as had become their habit. "About what Walking Bear said about honoring my gift, and about what that means in practical terms." She set down the sketchpad and turned to face him. "I've been doing calculations in my head, trying to figure out how to make this work, staying out here longer than my original plan." Austin's heart started beating faster. "And the magazines are paying me well for the articles I'm sending back, better than I expected, actually. Several editors have written saying they want more, that my pieces are popular with readers. If I'm careful with my money, and if the work continues, I could potentially stay in New Mexico territory for several more months." She paused, watching his face. "But I'd need to find more affordable lodging than the boarding house. Mrs. Chen is lovely, but her rates are adding up." The invitation was on Austin's lips before he could consider whether it was proper or wise or too fast. "Stay here, with me." Julia's eyes widened. "Austin, I couldn't. It wouldn't be proper, and your reputation, the talk in town." "I don't care about talk," he said fiercely. "I care about you being able to do your work, about having more time together, about not wasting these months we could have because of what people might say." He took her hands in his. "But if you're worried about your reputation, we could get married. Make it proper in everyone's eyes." The silence that followed was so complete Austin could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Had he just proposed? He thought he had. It wasn't the romantic, planned proposal a woman like Julia deserved, but it was honest, and maybe that mattered more. "Did you just ask me to marry you?" Julia's voice was faint, shocked. "I think I did," Austin said. "I know it's fast, probably too fast, but Julia, I'm 30 years old and I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I wake up happy because I know I'm going to see you. I go to sleep thinking about our conversations. You make this lonely place feel like home. So yes, I'm asking you to marry me if you'll have me." Julia was crying, he realized, tears streaming down her face though she was smiling. That's the most unromantic romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. Is that a yes? His heart was going to break through his chest if she didn't answer soon. It's a yes, Julia said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Austin O'Brien, I'll marry you. I'll stay here and draw your mountains and drive you crazy with my art supplies everywhere, and yes, yes, yes. He kissed her then, deep and long and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing and holding each other like they'd never let go. They were married 3 days later by the circuit judge who happened to be passing through Aztec on his monthly rounds. It was a simple ceremony in the small church, with Mrs. Chen and her husband as witnesses, and a handful of townspeople who'd come to know Julia during her stay at the boarding house. Julia wore a simple dress she'd bought at the general store, pale yellow cotton with lace at the collar, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers Austin had picked that morning. Austin wore his best clothes and boots so polished he could see his reflection, and when the judge pronounced them man and wife, Austin kissed his bride with a joy he'd thought lost to him forever. Mrs. Chen had organized a small reception at the boarding house, and the whole town seemed to turn out, curious about the Eastern artist woman who'd captivated their reclusive rancher. People brought food and well wishes, and Austin found himself accepting congratulations from men he'd barely spoken to in 3 years, feeling connected to this community in a way he'd deliberately avoided before now. Julia was radiant, moving through the crowd with easy grace, charming everyone she spoke to, making Austin proud and slightly amazed that this remarkable woman had chosen him. She told people about her articles, showed some of her sketches, and explained their plans for her to continue her work while helping Austin with the ranch. If anyone thought it was scandalous for a new bride to have professional aspirations, they kept it to themselves, won over by Julia's enthusiasm and obvious talent. As the sun set and the celebration wound down, Austin and Julia rode back to the ranch together, to the house that was now officially theirs rather than just his. Austin had spent the past 2 days making improvements, adding furniture to the empty office so Julia would have a proper studio, hanging curtains in the bedroom, building shelves for her growing collection of sketchpads and supplies. It still wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. "Welcome home, Mrs. O'Brien," Austin said as he helped Julia down from her horse. "Mrs. O'Brien," Julia repeated, trying out the name. "I like the sound of that, though I think I'll keep publishing under my maiden name. Julia Morrison has a nice, artistic ring to it. You can publish under whatever name you want," Austin said, sweeping her up in his arms to carry her over the threshold in the traditional manner. "As long as you come home to me at the end of the day." He carried her inside and set her down gently in the main room, which glowed warm with lamplight. Julia looked around at the home she'd only visited before, now seeing it with new eyes as her own space too. She walked slowly through the rooms, touching things, making small adjustments, already planning changes that would make the space more theirs and less just his. In the bedroom, Austin had done his best to make things special. He'd put fresh linens on the bed, placed wildflowers on the dresser, even hung one of Julia's mountain sketches on the wall where they'd see it first thing upon waking. Julia stood in the doorway taking it all in, then turned to him with tears in her eyes again. "You hung my art in our bedroom." "Of course I did. It's beautiful like you. I want to wake up every morning and see the mountains the way you see them." He moved closer, suddenly nervous despite everything they'd already shared. "Julia, I want you to know that I don't expect anything tonight. I know this has all happened very fast, and if you need time." She stopped him with a finger on his lips. "Austin O'Brien, stop being so noble. I married you because I love you and I want to be your wife in every sense of the word. Now please kiss me before I lose my nerve." He did kiss her, long and deep and with all the passion he'd been restraining for the past 2 weeks. Julia responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his in ways that made his breath catch and his heart race. They undressed each other slowly, reverently, both nervous and eager, learning the geography of each other's bodies with gentle touches and whispered encouragements. Making love to Julia was nothing like Austen's limited previous experience. With her, it felt like a conversation, both of them learning to read each other's responses, discovering what brought pleasure, what made the other gasp or sigh or pull closer. It was tender and awkward and beautiful, and when they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, both breathless and amazed, Austen felt more completely at peace than he had since before the war. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I know I haven't said it before, but I do." "I love you, Julia." "I love you too," she whispered back. "So much it scares me sometimes. I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for the first time in years, Austen didn't dream of war. Instead, he dreamed of mountains and starlight and a woman's hand holding his as they walked into a future that finally felt worth living. The weeks that followed their wedding settled into a rhythm that surprised both of them with how well it worked. Julia threw herself into both her art and ranch life with equal enthusiasm. She'd wake with Austen before dawn, help him with the morning chores, then spend the middle hours of the day sketching and writing her articles while he did the heavier work of maintaining fences and managing the cattle. In the late afternoon, they'd come together again, and she'd show him what she'd created while he told her about his day, and they'd prepare dinner together in the small kitchen that now felt warm and lived in rather than merely functional. Julia's articles started appearing in Eastern magazines regularly, accompanied by her beautiful sketches of the Western landscape. She wrote about the mountains and grasslands, about the wildlife and weather, about the challenge and beauty of life in the territories. But she also wrote about the people, carefully crafted pieces that protected privacy while still capturing the essential truth of Western life. She wrote about Walking Bear and his band without revealing their exact location or making them objects of curiosity. She wrote about the townspeople of Aztec, about Mrs. Chen and the circuit judge and the ranchers who stopped by occasionally to share news. And she wrote about ranch life, though she kept Austen's identity vague, protecting his privacy while still sharing the reality of what it meant to build a life in this isolated place. The money from her articles supplemented Austen's ranch income nicely, and they began to talk about long-term plans. Austen wanted to expand his herd, maybe build a proper barn to replace the open-sided structure he'd been using. Julia wanted to save enough to eventually self-publish a book of her Western sketches, a comprehensive visual record of the territory that could serve as both art and historical document. They worked hard, both of them, but they also made time for joy. On Sundays, they'd take long rides together, exploring parts of Austen's property he'd never bothered to visit, finding hidden valleys and seasonal streams, discovering the full extent of the land they now shared. Julia would sketch while Austen would sometimes just lie in the grass and watch clouds, enjoying the luxury of rest and companionship. As summer faded into fall, the landscape transformed around them. The grasslands turned gold, the aspen groves in the mountains blazed yellow and orange, and the air took on a crisp quality that made everything feel sharper and more vivid. Julia captured it all in her sketches, and Austen found himself seeing the seasonal changes through her eyes, appreciating details he'd overlooked during his solitary years. They celebrated Julia's 23rd birthday in October with a small party that Austen organized with help from Mrs. Chen. The older woman had become something of a mentor to Julia, teaching her how to preserve food for winter, how to make soap and candles, all the practical skills that would make life on the ranch more sustainable. Austen gave Julia a set of professional-grade drawing pencils he'd ordered from a catalog, ridiculously expensive, but worth it to see her face light up with joy. "These are too much," Julia protested, but she was already testing one on a scrap of paper, sighing with pleasure at the smooth, dark line it produced. "Austen, these cost a fortune." "You're worth a fortune," he said simply. "Your work deserves the best tools available." She kissed him thoroughly in front of Mrs. Chen and the other party guests, scandalizing some of the more conservative townspeople, but making Austen laugh with delight at her unself-conscious affection. As winter approached, they prepared the ranch together, Austen teaching Julia what needed to be done to ensure the cattle would survive the coming cold. They moved the herd to lower pastures with more shelter, stocked up on supplies in case they got snowed in, and laid in enough firewood to keep the house warm through the hardest months. Julia threw herself into learning all of it, determined to be a true partner in ranch operations rather than just a decorative addition to Austen's life. The first major snowfall came in late November, transforming the landscape overnight into something magical and strange. Julia had never seen snow like this, the heavy western snows that could pile up feet deep and last for months. She spent the entire morning sketching the transformed world, trying to capture how the mountains looked under their white blanket, how the familiar shapes of ranch buildings became surreal sculptures of snow and shadow. Austen watched her work from the warmth of the house, content to give her space for her art while he caught up on indoor tasks that had been neglected during the busy fall months. He was mending a saddle when Julia burst back inside, her cheeks pink with cold, her eyes bright with excitement. "Austen, you have to come see. The light on the mountains right now is extraordinary, and I want you there while I sketch it. Please?" He couldn't refuse her anything when she looked at him like that, so he bundled up and followed her back outside into the cold. She'd set up her easel near the corrals, where the view of the mountains was unobstructed, and she positioned him carefully before returning to her work. "Just stand there naturally," she instructed. "I want to capture you as part of this winter landscape, the rancher and his mountains united by snow." Austen stood still while she worked, watching her instead of the mountains, marveling at how this woman had so completely transformed his life in just 6 months. He'd been so certain he wanted isolation, that he needed to be alone to process his war trauma and find peace. But Julia had shown him a different path, one where healing came through connection rather than avoidance, where sharing his burden made it lighter rather than heavier. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked without looking up from her sketch. "You have a very intense expression." "You," he said honestly. "How lucky I am, how different my life would be if you hadn't decided to sketch my mountains that day." Now she did look up, her expression soft. "I think about that too, about how easily we might never have met, how I almost went to Colorado instead of New Mexico, how many small choices led to that morning when you found me." She set down her pencil and walked over to him, reaching up to brush snow from his shoulders. "I'm glad you didn't chase me off your land. Best decision I ever made," Austen said, pulling her close despite her protest that he was ruining her composition. "Well, second best. The best decision was asking you to marry me." They stood like that for a while, holding each other in the snow, until Julia finally pulled away with a laugh. "I really do need to finish this sketch before the light changes completely, But tonight, I promise you all my attention. I'll hold you to that, Mrs. O'Brien, Austin said, returning to his position. Winter deepened, and the ranch work slowed to just the essential tasks of keeping the cattle fed and the house functioning. It was the quietest time of year, the season Austin had always found hardest during his solitary years, because there was too much time to think, too much darkness, both literal and figurative. But with Julia, the winter felt cozy rather than oppressive. They spent long evenings by the fire, Julia sketching or writing while Austin read or worked on small projects, both of them simply enjoying being together. Julia taught Austin to see art in everyday things, to appreciate the composition of how firelight played across walls, the patterns in wood grain, the way shadows fell. Austin taught Julia about reading weather signs, about animal behavior, about the 100 small skills that made ranch life possible. They learned from each other constantly, each bringing their own expertise to their shared life, building something richer than either could have created alone. In January, a letter arrived from Julia's parents, the first communication she'd received from them since a brief note acknowledging her marriage. Austin watched Julia's face as she read, seeing worry crease her forehead. "What is it?" he asked gently. "They want to visit. In the spring, when travel is easier, they say they want to meet my husband and see how I'm living." She looked up at him with troubled eyes. "Austin, they're going to hate this. My mother is going to be horrified by the isolation and the rough conditions. My father is going to think you're some fortune hunter who took advantage of me. Do you want them to come?" That was the only question that mattered to him. Julia thought about it for a long moment. "Yes, I think I do. I miss them, despite everything. And I want them to see that I'm happy, that I made the right choice. I want them to know you, to understand why I stayed." She took his hand. "But I'm nervous about it too. What if they convince me to go back? What if seeing them makes me doubt all of this?" Austin squeezed her hand. "Then we'll deal with that if it happens. But Julia, I don't think you're going to doubt us. What we have is real and strong. Your parents will see that, and even if they don't approve immediately, they'll come around when they see how happy you are. You're sure?" She sounded so young and uncertain, needing his reassurance. "I'm sure. We'll make them welcome, show them everything that's good about this life, and trust that they love you enough to accept your choices." He pulled her into his arms. "Besides, I'm looking forward to proving to your father that I'm worthy of his daughter." Julia laughed against his chest. "That might take some doing. He has very high standards." "Good thing I'm motivated," Austin said, kissing the top of her head. They wrote back immediately, inviting Julia's parents to visit in late April when the weather would be pleasant, and the spring flowers would be blooming. Then they spent the rest of the winter preparing, making improvements to the house, planning menus, trying to anticipate any objection her parents might raise and proactively address it. As winter gradually loosened its grip and spring began to assert itself, the ranch came back to life. Calves were born, requiring round-the-clock attention during the busiest weeks. Julia threw herself into helping with the calving, staying up through the night with Austin when a birth was difficult, learning to bottle feed the orphaned or rejected calves, getting covered in mud and worse without complaint. Austin watched her handle these challenges with the same determination she brought to her art, and fell even more deeply in love with her strength and adaptability. Walking Bear and his band returned in early April, setting up their temporary camp on Austin's land as they had the previous year. This time, Julia greeted them as friends, her Spanish much improved after a winter of practice, and Walking Bear seemed pleased to see her again. He asked about her drawings, and Julia showed him the article she'd published featuring his people, carefully protecting their privacy while still honoring their culture. Walking Bear studied the illustrations for a long time, then nodded his approval. Through Austen's translation, Walking Bear said something that made Julia tear up. He says you see with an honest heart. He says your brother's spirit lives in your work, that you carry him with you and honor him by creating beauty. He says that's a good way to remember the dead. Julia thanked him in Spanish, then impulsively gave him another sketch she'd been working on, this one of the mountains in winter. Walking Bear accepted it gravely, and Austen noticed him carefully packing it away with his other possessions, treating it with the same care he'd give something sacred. Late April arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the grasslands, and the news that Julia's parents would arrive on the weekly stage from Santa Fe. Austen and Julia rode into Aztec together to meet them, both nervous despite their best efforts to appear calm. The stage rolled in right on time, and Austen got his first look at his in-laws. Charles Morrison was a tall, distinguished-looking man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and the kind of expensive suit that stood out dramatically in the rough western town. Margaret Morrison was small and elegant, dressed in traveling clothes that probably cost more than Austen's entire wardrobe, her face showing lines of worry and disapproval even before she'd stepped down from the stage. "Mother, father." Julia rushed forward to embrace them, and Austen saw her parents' expressions soften with genuine love for their daughter, whatever their reservations about her choices. "Julia, dear, let me look at you." Margaret held her daughter at arm's length, studying her with a mother's critical eye. "You've gotten so brown and thin. Are you eating properly out here?" "I'm perfectly healthy, Mother. The sun is just stronger here than in Philadelphia." Julia turned to draw Austen forward. "This is my husband, Austen O'Brien. Austen, my parents, Charles and Margaret Morrison." Austen extended his hand to Charles, who shook it with a grip designed to test, trying to take his measure. Austen returned the pressure firmly but not aggressively, meeting the older man's eyes steadily. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, it's a pleasure to meet you. Julia speaks of you often and with great affection. Mr. O'Brien." Charles's tone was carefully neutral. "I hope you'll understand that we were surprised by Julia's marriage. She left Philadelphia as a single woman on what we believed was a temporary artistic expedition, and suddenly we receive a letter saying she's married to a rancher in the New Mexico territory. I understand completely, sir. It happened quickly for us too. But I love your daughter very much, and I hope you'll give me the chance to prove I can make her happy." Austen was acutely aware of the townspeople watching this scene with interest, gossip being the primary entertainment in Aztec. Margaret was still studying Julia with concern. "Darling, are you certain about all this? It's not too late to reconsider. You could come home with us, get this marriage quietly annulled if it hasn't been." "Mother, stop." Julia's voice was firm. "I'm married, I'm happy, and I'm not reconsidering anything. I wrote to you and invited you here so you could see my life, not so you could try to rescue me from it." She took Austen's hand. "Now please, we have a wagon ready to take us to the ranch. It's about an hour's drive and I'm eager to show you our home." The ride to the ranch was tense, Margaret making small distressed sounds at every bump in the rough road, Charles asking pointed questions about Austen's property, income, and prospects. Austen answered honestly, not trying to make his circumstances sound better than they were, knowing that any deception would only make things worse. Julia sat beside him on the wagon seat, her hand firmly holding his, showing her parents through action where her loyalty lay. When they finally arrived at the ranch and Austen helped Margaret down from the wagon, he saw her taking in the modest house, the utilitarian outbuildings, the vast emptiness surrounding them. Her expression was one of barely concealed horror. "This is where you've been living?" she asked Julia faintly. "This is what you gave up your life in Philadelphia for." "This is my home," Julia said simply, "and I love it. Come inside, let me show you." Austin carried their luggage while Julia gave her parents a tour of the house. He watched Margaret take in the rough walls, the simple furniture, the lack of servants or conveniences, seeing it all as hardship and deprivation. But he also noticed when she paused at Julia's studio, seeing the professional setup, the stacks of completed sketches, the evidence of serious artistic work being done. "You've been productive," Charles observed, leafing carefully through some of Julia's sketches. "These are quite good, actually. Better than your earlier work." "I've had time and space to really develop my skills," Julia said. "No social obligations distracting me, just pure focus on my work. And Austin has been so supportive, building me this studio, making sure I have everything I need." Charles glanced at Austin with slightly less hostility. "You encourage her art, of course," Austin said. "Julia's talent is extraordinary. She's been published in several major magazines already, and I think she'll be one of the important Western artists of our generation." "Why would I not support that?" Margaret shook her head. "Because it's not normal for a ranch wife to be pursuing a professional career. Julia, you should be helping your husband, managing the household, preparing for a family. Instead, you're still playing at being an artist." "I'm not playing, Mother." Julia's voice was tight with controlled anger. "I'm working. I'm earning money with my art while also helping Austin with the ranch. I can do both." "For now, perhaps, but what about when children come?" Margaret pressed. "You can't be a proper mother and continue this artistic career." "We'll figure that out when the time comes," Julia said firmly. "But I'm not giving up my work, Mother. Not for you, not for society's expectations, not for anyone." The first evening was tense, everyone trying too hard to be polite, conversation stalling and starting awkwardly. Austin made dinner with Julia's help while her parents sat in the main room looking uncomfortable and out of place. The meal itself was simple but good. Beef and potatoes and vegetables from their garden, but Margaret picked at her food as if afraid of it while Charles ate in silence. After dinner, Charles asked Austin to step outside with him, and Austin knew this was the real conversation, the one that would determine whether Julia's parents accepted this marriage or spent the entire visit trying to undermine it. They stood on the porch in the gathering dusk, both men silent for a moment, taking measure of each other. Finally, Charles spoke. "I'll be direct, Mr. O'Brien. I don't like this situation. Julia is my only surviving child, and I had plans for her future that didn't involve isolation in the wilderness with a man I'd never met. She was meant to marry well in Philadelphia, to live a comfortable life near her family, to be safe and cared for." "I understand, sir. And I can't offer her the kind of life you envisioned. But I can offer her something she needed more: freedom to do her work, space to heal from her brother's death, and genuine partnership with someone who values her for exactly who she is." Austin met Charles's eyes. "I love your daughter. I know I'm not what you wanted for her, but I make her happy. Doesn't that count for something?" Charles studied him for a long moment. "Julia wrote in her letters that you're a war veteran." Which side? "Union, sir. I was at Gettysburg. My son died at Antietam. I sometimes wonder if your bullet killed him." The words hit Austin like a physical blow. "If it did, sir, I'm sorrier than I can possibly express. The war took too much from too many people." "Yes, it did." Charles's voice was heavy with old grief. "My wife and we were destroyed when Marcus died. And Julia, she grieved so deeply we worried she'd never recover. When she left to do this traveling project, we thought it would help her heal. But we never imagined she'd leave permanently, that she'd find a new life so far from us." "She hasn't left you," Austin said gently. "She just found a different path than the one you imagined for her, but she still loves you. All she wants is for you to accept her choices and be part of her life. Can you keep her safe out here? Can you give her a good life?" Charles's voice was raw with concern. "I'll spend every day of the rest of my life trying to do both those things," Austin promised. "I won't always succeed. Life out here can be hard and unpredictable, but I'll never stop trying." "Your daughter is the best thing that's ever happened to me, Mr. Morrison. I don't take that lightly." Charles nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "I believe you mean that, and I can see that Julia is happy, even if the circumstances aren't what I'd choose. But Mr. O'Brien, if you ever hurt her, if you ever make her regret this choice, you'll answer to me. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir. Though I promise you, if I ever hurt Julia, I'll be harder on myself than you could possibly be." They shook hands then, a tentative truce if not yet full acceptance. When they went back inside, Julia looked between them anxiously, trying to read the outcome of their conversation. Austin gave her a small smile and a nod, and he saw her shoulders relax. The next few days were still awkward, but gradually Charles and Margaret began to see what Julia and Austin had built together. Charles was impressed despite himself by the ranch operation, by the way Austin had built something viable from raw land, by the quality of the cattle and horses. Margaret slowly warmed as she saw how happy Julia truly was, how the rough conditions didn't seem to diminish her spirit, but rather strengthen it. The turning point came on the third day, when Julia took her parents on a horseback ride to see the mountains she'd been sketching in all her work. Margaret was nervous on horseback, never having ridden much, but she managed. When they reached the high meadow where Julia and Austin had first met, Julia told her parents the story of that morning, how she'd been trespassing without knowing it, how Austin had asked to be in her next drawing. "And that's when you fell in love?" Margaret asked, looking between Julia and Austin with something like wonder. "That's when it started," Julia admitted. "I'd never met anyone who understood me the way Austin did from the very beginning. He saw my art as legitimate work, not just a hobby. He listened to me talk about my dreams and didn't tell me they were impossible. And he needed someone to help him find his way back to life after the war." Austin felt his throat tighten with emotion. Julia so rarely spoke about what their relationship meant to her, usually showing her love through actions rather than words, and hearing her articulate it to her parents moved him deeply. "And you?" Charles asked Austin. "When did you know you loved my daughter?" Austin thought about it, really considered the question. "I think from that first morning, though I didn't recognize it for what it was. I'd been alone so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone's company. But then Julia was there, making art from my mountains, and suddenly I couldn't imagine going back to life without her." Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "That's actually quite romantic," she admitted, "even if the circumstances are terribly unconventional." They spent the afternoon in the meadow, Julia sketching while Austin pointed out features of his property to Charles, and Margaret slowly relaxed enough to actually enjoy the beautiful spring day. As they rode back to the ranch house in the golden light of late afternoon, Austin heard Margaret and Julia talking quietly, their earlier tension replaced by something warmer and more accepting. That night, Charles formally apologized for his initial hostility and acknowledged that Julia had found something good here, even if it wasn't what he'd envisioned for her. Margaret hugged her daughter tightly and whispered something that made Julia cry happy tears. The visit ended on the fifth day with tentative plans for Austin and Julia to visit Philadelphia the following year. and with Charles promising to send some additional ranch equipment that Austin had mentioned needing. After the stage carried Julia's parents back toward Santa Fe and eventually Philadelphia, Austin and Julia stood together watching the dust settle on the road. "That went better than I expected," Julia said, leaning against him. "Your parents love you. They just needed to see that you're truly happy." Austin wrapped his arms around her from behind. "And that I'm not some villain who trapped you out here. I think my father likes you now. He was asking me all kinds of questions last night about your war service, your plans for the ranch, how you treat me. I think he was impressed by your answers. Good, because I meant every word I said to him." Austin turned her in his arms to face him. "Julia, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. I know we rushed into marriage and there are still things we're learning about each other, but I've never been more certain of anything than I am about us." "Neither have I," Julia said softly. "I love you, Austin. I love this life we're building. I don't regret a single choice I made that brought me here." They kissed there in the late afternoon sun. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something beautiful from loneliness and shared pain and unexpected connection. As spring turned to summer, life on the ranch settled into new routines. Julia's work gained more recognition, with her Western articles appearing in prestigious publications and generating substantial income. She started planning her book of sketches in earnest, organizing years of work into a coherent collection that would tell the story of the territory through her eyes. Austin supported her completely, even hiring one of his seasonal ranch hands on a more permanent basis, so he'd have more time to help Julia with her project. In July, Julia realized she was pregnant. She told Austin one evening after dinner, nervously because they'd never explicitly discussed children, had just vaguely agreed they'd figure that out when it happened. "Are you happy about it?" she asked anxiously, watching his face for his reaction. Austin felt joy burst through him like sunrise. "Happy, Julia, I'm thrilled. We're going to have a baby in January, the doctor in Aztec thinks, if his calculations are right." She was smiling now, reassured by his enthusiasm. "Are you sure this is what you want?" "Because we're going to have so much less time together, and the baby will need constant attention, and everything will change." "Everything already changed when I met you," Austin said, pulling her into his arms carefully, already protective of the new life growing inside her. "This is just the next wonderful change. We're going to be parents, Julia. We're going to have a family." Julia burst into tears, the emotional kind that came with pregnancy, and Austin held her while she cried and laughed and talked about all her fears and hopes for their coming child. They spent the evening making plans, discussing how to convert the unused room into a nursery, what supplies they'd need, how to prepare for the reality of caring for an infant in such an isolated location. The pregnancy agreed with Julia. She bloomed with it, her already beautiful features taking on an added glow that made Austin catch his breath sometimes just looking at her. She continued her sketching throughout, determined to finish organizing her book before the baby arrived, though Austin insisted she rest more and accept help with the heavier ranch tasks. Walking Bear and his band came through in early September, and the old leader noticed Julia's condition immediately. Through Austin, he offered traditional blessings for the coming child and gave Julia a small deerskin pouch filled with herbs, explaining through gesture and limited words that it was for a healthy birth. Julia accepted it with tears of gratitude, touched by his kindness. As fall progressed and Julia's pregnancy advanced, they prepared for the baby's arrival with mounting excitement and nervousness. Mrs. Chen came out to the ranch several times to check on Julia and teach Austin, what he'd need to know to help with the birth, since the doctor might not be able to reach them if winter weather was bad. Austin absorbed every instruction with fierce concentration, determined to be ready to help Julia through whatever came. Winter arrived early that year, with the first snow falling in mid-November. Julia finished organizing her book manuscript and sent it off to a publisher in New York who'd expressed interest, then focused on preparing the nursery and her own mind for motherhood. She sketched less frequently now, her hands swollen and her back aching, but she still couldn't resist capturing the beauty of their first winter together as an almost complete family. On a bitterly cold night in late January, Julia went into labor. Austin sent their ranch hand galloping through the snow toward town to fetch the doctor while he stayed with Julia, helping her through the contractions with gentle hands and encouraging words. The doctor arrived hours later, but by then, Julia was deep into labor and Austin was supporting her completely, his own fear pushed aside by the need to be strong for his wife. Their son was born just before dawn on a morning so cold the windows were frosted with ice patterns. He came into the world screaming his displeasure at the cold air, pink and perfect and impossibly small in Austin's hands. Julia wept with exhaustion and joy as Austin placed their son on her chest, both of them staring in wonder at what they'd created together. "He's beautiful," Austin whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're amazing. You did it." "We did it," Julia corrected, looking up at him with exhausted but glowing eyes. "What should we name him?" They discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never decided definitively. Now, looking at his son's tiny face, Austin knew exactly what felt right. "Marcus, after your brother, if that's all right with you." Julia started crying again, nodding too overcome to speak. They named their son Marcus Austin O'Brien, honoring the past while looking toward the future. The first weeks of parenthood were exhausting and overwhelming and more wonderful than either had imagined. Marcus was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his mother's blue eyes and what looked like it would be his father's dark hair. Austin discovered reserves of tenderness he didn't know he possessed, spending hours just holding his son, marveling at the perfect tiny features, feeling his heart expand in ways he'd never experienced. Julia struggled at first to balance motherhood with her art, frustrated by the way her time and energy were consumed by Marcus's needs. But gradually she adapted, learning to sketch with one hand while nursing, creating intimate drawings of domestic life that were different from her grand landscapes, but no less powerful. She wrote articles about parenthood on the frontier that resonated deeply with her readers, who appreciated her honest portrayal of both the joys and challenges. The seasons turned, Marcus grew, and their life continued its steady rhythm. Walking Bear met Marcus during the band's spring migration and gave the baby a traditional blessing, which Austin and Julia accepted with gratitude. Julia's book of Western sketches was published to critical acclaim, establishing her reputation as a serious artist documenting an important period in American expansion. Austin's ranch continued to prosper, and he expanded his operation, hiring more help so he could spend more time with his growing family. More children followed. A daughter named Rose was born 2 years after Marcus, with her mother's auburn hair and a sunny disposition. Then 3 years later, twin boys they named Thomas and William, who kept their parents constantly exhausted but laughing. The house that had once been so empty was suddenly full of noise and life. Children's drawings on the walls alongside Julia's professional sketches, toys scattered across the floor, love in every corner. As the children grew, Julia taught them to see the world through an artist's eyes, while Austin taught them to read the land and understand the rhythms of ranch life. Marcus showed early talent with animals, able to gentle even the most skittish horse. Rose loved sketching almost as much as her mother, filling pad after pad with her observations of the world around her. The twins were wild and adventurous, requiring constant supervision but bringing joy everywhere they went. Julia continued to create art, though now her work had a different focus. She documented their family life, the growth of their ranch, the changing territory around them. She published occasional articles but was no longer dependent on that income, as Austin's ranch had become quite successful. Instead, she created for the love of it, for the need to capture beauty and meaning, for the desire to leave a visual record of their lives for future generations. Austin had never imagined he could be so happy. The man who'd fled to the wilderness seeking isolation had found instead a full, rich life surrounded by love. The war memories that had once haunted him daily had faded to occasional shadows, managed through Julia's patient support and the healing power of family. He sometimes thought about that morning when he'd heard charcoal scratching on paper and discovered a woman sketching his mountains, about how easily he might have ridden away and never found this life. One evening, with all 4 children finally asleep and the house quiet, Austin and Julia sat together on their porch as they had so many times before. Julia was sketching by lamplight, capturing the way the moonlight illuminated the mountains, while Austin sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, content just to be near her. "What are you working on?" he asked, though he could partially see the drawing taking shape. "Our story," Julia said, showing him the sketch. It depicted the flat boulder where they'd first met, with 2 figures visible, a man and a woman, connected across the distance by invisible lines of attraction and understanding. "That's beautiful," Austin said softly. "Like everything you create. It's for our children and their children after them, so they'll know how we found each other, how love grew from loneliness and art, and these mountains that brought us together." Julia set down her sketch pad and turned to face him. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your solitude, taking on a wife and family and all the complications that came with it?" "Never," Austin said without hesitation. "Not for a single moment. You gave me back my life, Julia. You showed me that healing comes through connection, not isolation. Everything good in my life started the morning I found you sketching my mountains." "Our mountains now," Julia corrected, smiling. "Our mountains," Austin agreed. "Our land, our home, our life. Everything we built together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, the same mountains that had brought them together, the same vast landscape that had once represented only escape, but now meant home. Inside the house, one of the twins cried out in sleep, then settled, comforted by the presence of his siblings. A coyote called from somewhere in the distance, and Austin's cattle lowed softly in their pasture. The wind moved through the juniper trees with a sound like whispered secrets, and overhead the Milky Way blazed in impossible glory. "I want to show you something," Julia said suddenly, reaching into the pocket of her skirt. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed now with age, and handed it to Austin. He unfolded it carefully and felt his breath catch. It was the first sketch she'd ever done of him, that morning when he'd stood awkwardly while she captured him against the mountain backdrop. He looked young in the drawing, lonely despite his attempt at stoic composure, a man still carrying the weight of war and isolation. "I've kept it all these years," Julia said softly, "to remind me of where we started, of how far we've both come." Austin studied the drawing, seeing himself through Julia's eyes on that long-ago morning. "I was so lost then. I didn't even realize how lost until you found me." "We found each other," Julia said. Neither of us knew what we were looking for, but somehow we recognized it when we met. Austin carefully refolded the sketch and handed it back to her. Keep it safe, along with all the others. Someday our grandchildren will want to see these, to know the story of the lonely rancher and the traveling artist who found each other in the shadow of New Mexico mountains. It's a good story, Julia said, leaning her head on his shoulder. It's our story, Austin corrected. And it's not over yet. We still have so much life ahead of us, so many more mornings watching the sun rise over our mountains, so many more evenings like this. They sat together until the cold drove them inside, then moved through the familiar evening routine of banking the fire, checking on sleeping children, preparing for bed. In their room, with the moonlight painting silver patterns across the walls and Julia's mountain sketch hanging where they could see it first thing upon waking, they held each other close. "I love you," Julia whispered into the darkness. "I'll love you until the mountains wear away to nothing." "I love you too," Austin replied, his arms tightening around her. "Thank you for sketching my mountains that day. Thank you for saying yes when I asked to be in your drawing. Thank you for staying." "There was never anywhere else I wanted to be," Julia said simply. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, safe and warm and home. Outside, the mountains stood eternal under the stars, witnesses to love stories played out over centuries, to people finding each other against all odds, to the quiet miracle of two lonely souls recognizing their match. The wind continued its ancient song. The creek murmured over stones, and in the small house at the base of the mountains, a family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they belonged exactly where they were. As the years continued to pass, the O'Brien family grew and thrived. Marcus, their eldest, inherited his father's way with land and animals, eventually taking over much of the ranch management as Austin aged. He married a young woman from Aztec, a teacher named Catherine, and they gave Austin and Julia their first grandchildren, continuing the family story into a new generation. Rose developed her mother's artistic talent, eventually attending art school in Chicago but always returning home to New Mexico, unable to stay away from the landscapes she loved. She published her own book of Western sketches, dedicating it to Julia, acknowledging the mother who taught her to see beauty everywhere. The twins, Thomas and William, were inseparable throughout their lives, eventually starting their own ranch partnership on land adjacent to their father's property, expanding the O'Brien holdings and ensuring the family would remain connected to this land for generations. Julia continued to create art until her hands grew too stiff with arthritis to hold a pencil steady. By then, she'd produced a body of work that documented decades of Western life, a visual history invaluable to those who came after. Her sketches were exhibited in galleries from New York to San Francisco, and scholars wrote papers about her unique perspective on frontier life. But she remained humble about her achievements, more interested in creating than in accolades. Austin remained vigorous well into his 70s, still riding out to check his fences and cattle, still finding peace in the mountains that had been the backdrop to his entire adult life. He never lost his gratitude for the chance encounter that had transformed his existence, never stopped marveling at how completely Julia had healed the wounds war had left on his soul. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the house Austin had built as a lonely refuge but which had become a home full of love, Julia gave him one final drawing. It showed the two of them as they were now, aged but still clearly themselves, standing together looking out at their beloved mountains. But if you looked closely, you could see ghosted images behind them, their younger selves, all the moments of their life together layered and visible. "So we never forget where we started," Julia said, her voice still strong despite her years. "And so everyone who comes after knows that this all began with a lonely rancher finding a woman sketching his mountains and having the courage to ask if he could be in her next drawing." Austin looked at the drawing, tears streaming down his weathered face, and pulled his wife close. Around them, their family talked and laughed and celebrated, the house echoing with the sound of life lived fully. Outside, the mountains stood eternal, unchanged by the passage of time, beautiful and enduring. The love story of Austin and Julia O'Brien became a cherished family legend, passed down through generations, embellished perhaps, but always true in its essentials. The sketches Julia created throughout her life were preserved carefully, eventually donated to museums where they helped future generations understand what life had been like in the territories, what courage it took to build something from nothing, what beauty existed in the vast western landscapes. But most importantly, those sketches and the story behind them reminded everyone who saw them that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, that loneliness can be healed, that two people finding each other against all odds can create ripples that extend far beyond their own lives. Austin O'Brien lived to be 82 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep with Julia beside him, his hand in hers. His last view through his bedroom window, those mountains he'd bought as a broken man seeking isolation, but which had given him everything he'd never known he needed. Julia followed him 3 years later, her final drawing left unfinished on her easel, a sketch of those same mountains under morning light, eternal and beautiful and forever theirs. They were buried side by side in a small cemetery overlooking their ranch, their graves marked with a stone that bore their names and dates, and a simple inscription Julia had requested. He asked to be in her drawing, and she drew him into her heart forever. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through generations of O'Briens who knew the story and honored it. The house was preserved, eventually becoming a small museum dedicated to Julia's art and to frontier life. And every year on the anniversary of that first meeting, descendants of Austin and Julia would gather at the flat boulder where it all began, bringing wildflowers to lay there in tribute to the power of chance encounters and the courage to pursue unexpected love. The mountains remained, as they always would, standing witness to the countless stories played out in their shadow, blessing the land and the people who loved it enough to make it home. And sometimes, in the right light, if you looked carefully at that flat boulder where a traveling artist once sat sketching, you might almost see the ghost of those two figures, forever frozen in that moment of first connection, proof that love stories, when true enough, can echo through time itself. This was the legacy of Austin O'Brien and Julia Morrison, two souls who found each other when both were lost, who built a life from loneliness and art and the vast beauty of the New Mexico territory, who proved that the best love stories are the ones written with courage and honesty, and the willingness to see beyond what you thought you wanted to recognize what you truly need.